Welcome to the Outthinker podcast. Each week, we talk with forward-looking strategists and innovators that are challenging the status quo, leading the future of business, and shaping our world. I'm your host, Kaihan, founder of the Outthinker Strategy Network. David Duncan is the author of a recently released book that I just loved. The Secret Lives of Customers, a detective story about solving the mystery of customer behavior. He's a senior partner at Innosight, the firm co-founded by Clayton Christensen. He's also the co-author of 2 other books and a number of influential articles. Competing Against Luck, which he co-authored with Clayton Christensen, is really a groundbreaking book that introduced a simple yet profound idea. Customers don't buy products and services, they hire them to do a job. He authored Building a Growth Factory with Scott Anthony, who has also been a guest on this podcast. And he's the author of several HBR articles like Knowing When to Reinvent and Build an Innovation Engine in 30 Days. In this episode, he shares why so many companies, business leaders, and strategists mistake the reasons their customers buy from them and why this mistake can be fatal, why focusing on jobs to be done can help you avoid this trap, and why you should start with small data before you get into big data. With a psychology degree from Duke and then a PhD in physics from Harvard, David launched his career at McKinsey and then Innosight and collaboration with Clayton Christensen from a truly broad systems perspective. And he shows why such a perspective is helpful to take if you want to understand and build the capacity to innovate your strategy. Ladies and gentlemen, David Duncan. David, thank you so much for taking the time to be here. I imagine you must be very busy with the release of your new book, which I read and I found really engaging and fascinating. We want to get into that and your work, but just to get people to know you a little bit personally, I'd like you to finish this sentence for me in any way that you would like to, which is, if you really knew me, David, you would know that. How would you complete that sentence?
Thanks, Kaihan, for having me on today. I would complete that sentence by saying, I've always been somebody who loves to try to understand things at a deep level. Not saying I'm always successful at that, but I tend to focus and obsess on certain puzzles over long periods of time, try to get to the bottom of them. And it's one of the things that's been an animating force, I'd say, in my life in terms of the choices I made to what I've studied in school and what I've done in my career.
Got it. Well, maybe you could tell us a little bit more about what you did in school. And I thought it was interesting when we were preparing for this, when I asked you about what got you interested in strategy. What got you interested in strategy?
I went to school and studied philosophy and then physics in graduate school. So I actually did a PhD in physics a while back. And it was while I was studying physics, of all things, that I got interested in strategy. While I was in school, I discovered that loving physics and loving being a physicist are 2 different things. So I was really grateful for the experience. I learned a ton, but decided I didn't want to pursue that beyond grad school as a career path. And so I was exploring, even in the last couple of years, things outside of science. I discovered there was something called management consulting. I'd never really heard of it or knew much about it, and heard about a firm called McKinsey and a few others. And they would recruit to some degree in programs like this. And I went to an introductory session for graduate students outside of business that one of them put on, and listened to a leader in the firm over the course of an hour talk us through a case exercise, which is similar to the types of cases they teach in business school, I now know, about a company that made something relatively obscure. I can't remember exactly what it was. It was some kind of basic part for oil processing plants, something along those lines. And it was this wildly profitable industry, just had these super high margins. And it was a bit of a puzzle. And he talked us through the underlying reasons for that. And at the end, he said, well, I've just talked you through something called a Porter's 5 forces analysis, which again, I had never heard of before. And he was introducing us to an aspect of strategic thinking. I thought it was fascinating that there were these laws and patterns in the business world that you could discover that are loosely analogous to physical laws. And that's where I first was exposed to it and started reading about it.
Yeah, I think that often those boring businesses, because as Porter would say, they have fewer entrants, fewer MBA grads trying to launch startups there, they're often the most profitable.
Yeah.
So let's talk about strategy. I asked this question of everyone that's on this podcast, and I have not gotten the same answer twice, which is, what's your definition of strategy?
That's a great question. And I have to say, my definition of strategy is a mashup of three other people's definition of strategy. So I don't think the world needs a new definition of strategy because there's some really excellent ones out there by great thought leaders. So mine's a mashup of Roger Martin, Michael Porter, and Clay Christensen, not surprisingly.
Why not surprisingly?
Well, they're very well regarded thought leaders and gurus in the field of strategy and business thinking more broadly. I most often use Roger's definition, which is something along the lines of a set of mutually reinforcing choices, primarily about where to play and how to win, because I find that to be very helpful when we're working with our clients on strategy related problems. It emphasizes this idea of strategy being about choice and certain choices, most importantly, where you're going to play, how you're going to win. And then I layer onto that Michael Porter's notion of what it means to win. He has this idea that winning is not a zero sum game in competitive strategy and business, but rather it's about winning with a specific customer. They choose your product over others. And there's plenty of room for lots of different companies to compete for different customers and all to win. And then I layer onto that Clay's idea of, well, how do you win with a customer? And he talked a lot about this idea of jobs to be done and winning with customers, about solving for a certain job to be done that they have. So I think about all of those things at once when I think about what strategy is. And I know we're probably going to get into this idea of jobs to be done in a little bit.
Yes, I definitely want to get into that. And I love the way that you've taken their three core ideas and patched them together and shown how they interconnect with each other. And it does seem, before we get into your book, if I look at your past work, it does seem like here is a philosopher and physicist, two very different fields, and you come at problems with this multi-point solution look, kind of a systems look. Can you just tell us a little bit about that? How would you characterize the work that you're known for?
Well, I've worked on and written and spoken most often on the topic of how organizations can build systematic capabilities to innovate. And that derives from the work that I and other colleagues at Innosight have been doing for the last 15 or 20 years or so. And I think the spark for that was, so Innosight is the company I work for, started by Clayton Christensen 20 years ago. And I think the spark for that theme was his book, The Innovator's Dilemma. So I'm sure listeners of this podcast and you are very familiar with that book. But
highly influential book, yeah.
the essence of that book is that large, successful companies, as they become larger and more successful, get hardwired into a certain way of doing things. And then when the world around them changes and they need to evolve, either because they're being disrupted or because non-traditional competitors are coming in and competing in a different way, or simply because they've run out of growth headroom in their current businesses, all of those are forces that impel them to evolve into new businesses that look quite different by definition than what's made them successful up to that point. And it's very, very hard for companies to do that. Clay called that the innovator's dilemma. And the reason it is such a dilemma is because there isn't just one single reason that companies have that challenge. There's probably 100. Some of them relate to the culture and the beliefs and assumptions. Some of them relate to the metrics they use to measure themselves or the metrics that markets use to measure them, to the way strategy gets set, to these shorter term time horizons that they're all operating under. There's a whole host of reasons that it's hard for them to evolve into new innovative growth businesses. And so we, over the course of Innosight's history, have been trying to understand, well, what are all of those reasons? What are the root causes underlying the difficulty in doing that? And then what are some solutions for it? So we've developed a system model for how you can evolve the fundamental elements of how you do strategy, how you allocate resources, how you innovate, such that you can create a kind of perpetual growth engine.
Fascinating. So I guess I'm just trying to link this to something I've been thinking about this past week. I was with a client and they've been very successful. The problem is they don't know why they've been so successful. And so when they try to explain, especially the CEO tries to explain it, he describes many, many, many different kind of minute little rules. And I'm thinking what you're saying is if you don't know what your formula is now, when something changes or a new opportunity presents itself, it might be hard, therefore, to adjust.
That's absolutely right. So the first step is to have a clear model for how you're operating today, why you're successful and why you're unsuccessful. And I think with respect to innovation, that's surprisingly hard for companies that are even really great at it to do. And most large companies are pretty good at innovation, even if they're very self-critical about it or they think, well, we're not Apple or Amazon. They're actually really good at it. Otherwise, they never would have gotten large to begin with, right? You have to have innovated over an extended period of time to have any measure of success. but they don't always know how it's happening or what's enabling it or what's getting in the way. So the system perspective we take on understanding innovation in organizations is first an approach to mapping out and really understanding how things are happening, whether it's codified or whether it's informal or not. And then thinking about then, well, what's working well, what's not working well, how can we intervene in intentional ways to make it more effective?
Fascinating. Yeah, and it makes sense that a philosophy physics major would be able to take that systems perspective. I want to talk about your new book now. And if you could just lay out for us, what is the main message and what can strategists use the book for?
The book is called The Secret Lives of Customers, and it's about how anyone in any role, in any kind of organization really can learn how to understand the customers that they serve or that they want to serve. And that's a very broad audience, but it derives from a broad yet specific definition I have of what a customer is. That's another maybe philosophical question. What's a customer that you don't necessarily think about? But I think about it as a person, a group, or an organization whose problems and goals you want to understand well enough that you can find ways to help them. And by help them, I mean help them solve those problems and achieve those goals. And that definition has a few implications. Firstly, it's a positive framing of what a customer is, right? A customer is not somebody that you're trying to exploit or fleece. It's somebody that you want to help, and you may or may not be compensated for helping them. But your primary orientation going into that relationship is you're trying to find ways to really help them. And then the other implication of that definition is that everyone in an organization both has customers and is a customer. That's obviously true for people in sales or marketing or product development who are worried about the external customers, but it's also true internally. If you're in a role like HR or finance, you have customers you serve internally. In other words, people or groups whose problems you want to help solve or goals you want to help achieve. And even if you're a manager, the people on your team that you're managing are your customers in this sense, right? Because they have problems and goals you want to help them with, and vice versa. So that's a broad definition why everybody has customers as a customer. And finally, if it's by definition someone you're trying to help, well, then the first thing you need is a way to understand from the customer's perspective exactly what is it that they would find helpful. And my book is about how to do that. And it surprised me to reflect on this, and still surprises me a little bit, but I don't think there is any standard way out there analogous to, say, Lean Six Sigma or something like that, where there's this well-established standard and methodology for the average person to learn how to understand customers. There's a lot of very sophisticated methods in data science departments or market research departments, but there isn't a way that I've seen that you can point to that just anybody can learn how to do it. And that was the gap I was trying to fill in the market.
Got it. So like systematize what can be a very intuitive, soft approach and make it accessible, repeatable.
Right. Right.
Just to bring that to life a little bit for us, there's one story you have of a customer who comes into a coffee shop because we think that she likes great coffee, but then you find out that she always comes on Monday, Wednesdays, and Fridays for other different reasons. Could you just briefly describe that for us so we can visualize what we're talking about?
Sure. So the book itself is written in a somewhat unorthodox format.
Yeah, tell us about that. I love the format of the book, by the way. I love the format. So please tell us about why you chose that.
Right.
You wrote it as like a financial detective mystery, right? So as a fictional detective mystery. So tell us, why did you choose that?
Well, so it was inspired by a book I read many years ago called The Five Dysfunctions of a Team by Patrick Lencioni, who's written, I'm sure your listeners are familiar with him as well, but he's written a whole series of books. He calls them leadership fables. And the format is about 85% of the book is a fictional story where there's some company or leadership team that has a problem, and then they work through to get to the answer to that problem by using whatever it is he's trying to teach, the framework or model or tools. And then he steps out of the story at the end for the last 10 or 15% in a nonfiction section and explains these frameworks directly. And I remember reading that book 10 or 15 years ago. I read it in a couple of hours. It was a really fun read. I never looked back at it because I never needed to, because I never forgot what was in it. It just made a really strong impression on me. I thought it was very helpful, really well done. And so as I thought about, well, how could you write a book about understanding customers that had broad appeal, in principle, accessibility, I thought that would be the perfect format, because not everybody has the desire to read a more technical business book. But there was also something about this topic in particular that I think made it amenable to that format. Because if you're trying to teach somebody how to have a conversation with a customer that's useful, and by useful, I mean it gives you insights into their problems and goals so you can find a way to help them, the best way is to watch somebody else do it and then have a conversation about what happened and what was learned and what the techniques were. Because oftentimes the most useful aspects of those conversations are unexpected and they ramble around a little bit. And often it's that rambling that leads to the greatest insights. And when you see one done well, it often seems a little chaotic and even not that helpful until you learn the underlying principles that were guiding the interview and that were guiding the insights that they got out of it. And so I wanted to depict that feel of those interviews. So there's a lot of fictitious market research interviews in the story. And I wanted to show how they really look and feel and then step back and pull off the veil on that to explain it. Now, getting back directly to your question about this one example, the plot centers around this fictitious chain of coffee shops and the mystery they have of why they're losing customers, even though they've until then been on this very successful growth trajectory. It's written as a detective story because I've always felt there was this analogy between doing customer research and detective work, where you're trying to gather clues and discern patterns and piece together pieces of a puzzle to crack the case. And so the detective in the story is a market researcher who goes out and tries to understand, well, why are people going into the cafe? What is it they're trying to solve for when they're there? What types of problems and goals do they have for which they choose the cafe? And there's a diversity of answers to that question that he discovers. And one is the one you're alluding to, which is one of the characters goes into the cafe every Monday, Wednesday, Friday morning after class to basically just do her homework and get work done. And it happens to be around the corner and it happens to perfectly fit from her school and it perfectly fits the characteristics that she needs from it, which is there's some level of anonymity so she can focus and get work done. It's convenient and it's a better solution than any other solutions.
And you describe it in this idea of jobs to be done. And I think Scott did mention jobs to be done as well. But if you could explain what job to be done is.
The basic idea is that what drives customer behavior is the existence of important unsatisfied jobs that they want to get done. So a job can be a problem that somebody wants to solve, like repair my car or soothe my sore throat, or it can be a goal they want to accomplish, like run a marathon or get into college. A problem or a goal can be a job to be done. And when these jobs arise in our lives, we're motivated to seek out products or services or experience to hire. So we use a kind of jobs as a metaphor to hire to perform those jobs, just like we might hire a person to do a job like fixing a leaky pipe or babysitting the kids. A job is the why that motivates someone to seek or embrace or reject a new solution. So it's a causal model for why customers buy things and reject other things. So if you can understand what that job is, then the solutions you develop are more likely to be successful. So one of the techniques of this market detective is to go in and try to uncover what these jobs are as a way of understanding the causality for why people came to the cafe in the first place and then why they left.
We could dig in, I think, as many levels as you could on what those sub jobs to be done are. It seems to me that this is a natural application of some big data to be able to parse people, segment people out into the different sub jobs to be done. But I know in your book, you talk about, hey, data can be powerful, but only if you're looking at the world through the right lens. Can you talk to me about data versus qualitative research?
One of the central themes of the book is this idea of small data before big data. So absolutely a believer in data and the power of big data and analytics and all of the wonderful analytical tools that are being innovated all the time these days. But the insights you're going to get from data are only as good as the quality of the questions you're asking when you gather the data. And to ask the right questions, it's, in my view, essential to start with small data, and ideally small data that's gathered from direct conversations with human beings. Because as soon as you try to query a person through a survey or a data or online instrument of some sort, you are greatly constraining what it is you're likely to learn. Whereas in a qualitative one-on-one conversation, and I call the one-on-one conversation the atomic unit of customer research techniques because it's the most fundamental one in my view. If you can learn to do that well, you can learn all of the others. If you start there, then you can be more exploratory and be open to being surprised by what you're going to learn, and you can hear how the customer themselves frame what they're thinking about. Then you can use that to inform your big data gathering activities. And so I think both are important, but I think there's a tendency or a temptation these days to start with data, big data, and stay there as opposed to thinking about small data first.
Yeah, dump all that data in a box and let it give us the answer. That makes a lot of sense. All right. Well, there are tons of other questions I have for you. I'd love to explore this further. However, we have reached the top of our time with you, and I know that you've got a lot of other things to do. So people who want to connect with you, how can they do that and learn more and engage with your work?
The best way is to go to www.marketdetective.com, which is the website for my book. There's links to other information about these ideas, my Twitter, LinkedIn links, and so on. So that would be where I would direct people.
Great. Excellent. David, thank you so much for being with us and for writing this book. I thoroughly enjoyed reading it, and it is going to change the way people think about research and shaping strategy. Thank you to our guests. Thank you to our producers, Karina Reyes and Zach Ness, our editor, and the rest of the team. If you like what you heard, please follow, download, and subscribe. I'm your host, Kaihan Krippendorf. Thank you for listening. We'll catch you next week with another episode of Outthinkers.